Got to say, brah, and I'm not capping at all. That was a mad pang.
When I listen to myself saying that stuff, I just think, oh my God, get out of here, because it's just not appropriate for me at my age with the look that I have to be using that language. But it was fun to research, and of course that my point really I've used, as I'm sure everyone has understood, I've used that area of youth language to promote something else, not specifically talking about youth language, but talking about, oh, thank you, Gabby, you're too sweet. But talking about the idea of responding to what our students want and need. So yeah.
And I think that in that respect, there was a really interesting point that was being made by Gabby in chat when she made reference to the need for her to be kind of able to communicate on her niece's terms, which I found really interesting, because I think a lot of us assume that youth speak, like many other lexical dialects, exists to exclude. But there seems to be quite a strong evidence that, in fact, this is about not exclusion of old people like us, but simply the formation of an identity. And therefore, and I think Gabby said something to me earlier in the week about this, where she said it's really critical that students like my niece can have access to this language, and because it's what really motivates them. And therefore, is youth speak something that, even if we can't speak it fluently ourselves, that as teachers around the world, that we should be attending to in some way in order to motivate young learners, the youth that would be using it? Or are we actually appropriating something that we should really steer clear of? What are your views on this?
My views on that are that we're not appropriating it unless we're trying to get down with the kids. You know, that idea of maybe teaching a group of young learners or teenagers and trying to appear to be a friend of theirs, be one of them. That for me is false, and it's appropriation. But I think, as I think I tried to make the point in the input, that we should be offering exposure. I mean, I will never use the word cheugy. There's no question about that. It doesn't enter into my lexicon. But that doesn't mean that I can't introduce people to it if I think it's relevant to them. So the answer is, really, for me, the answer is to be providing exposure to people. I've just been approached by a very large dog here. It's a shame we can't see her, but she's huge. Come in a little bit closer and say hello. No, you're not going to say hello. Do you want to say hello? Sorry. She doesn't use cheugy either. I asked her. And so yeah, so that's the question. That's the answer, really. Give people what they need and according to the context that they're moving into.
There was a comment that came up also in chat. I'm seeing if I can find it, from and apologies if the pronunciation of, oh, hello. Oh, Farid Jumaga, I think, was asking about resources. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I think for the first time in a very long time, as I participated, I watched the input session, as of all of our other participants have done. And I felt for the first time that I could really empathize with them as international users of English, because this was as foreign to me as perhaps it is to them. And I just don't know where I would start in being able to teach this confidently and well. And it was really interesting that you were talking about some activities that are much more learner-centered. What advice would you give to teachers around the world who want to approach this in terms of feeling confident to work with this particular set of language?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for holding my feet to the fire on that one. The advice that I would give is general advice, and the general advice is try to make it teacher-centered. Stop it now. Oi. So try to make it learner-centered. Sorry. So that learners have some sort of ownership of the thing. So the example of the activity that I gave where students are invited to go away and research themselves takes you out of the equation. Or you become then a kind of director of activity, which I personally feel is a good role for a teacher to have, so that more students are discovering for themselves, and more students are, in a sense, teaching each other, introducing each other to things that they've discovered. For me, that's a great thing, and it's the way it should be, as far as I'm concerned, whether we're talking about youth language or any other kind of language. Does that answer your question?
It does. And perhaps as a follow-up question, as we were watching the webinar, one of the things I wanted to do was myself a challenge of actually, how would I try to be that director of activity? So I went to Google, as I'm sure many of us would do, and I thought, well, what are my search terms? And that was the first interesting thing, because it was actually quite difficult to know how to kind of get into pages that would give people who are interested a way in. You talked about the research that you did. Were there any particular terms that you used to try to find your examples of you speak that you found to be particularly productive?
Well, I did two kinds of research. I Googled and I put in current youth speak, that's all. And the other thing I did was to ask my grandkids. So I WhatsApped my grandkids and said, what are you using? How are you speaking to each other? And without any other parameters. And it was quite interesting what came back, because they really had to think about this. Obviously, these are things that they're using every day. Right. And so they had to dig deep. I'm talking about people who are 18, 14, 11, that kind of age group. Mm-hmm. And they came back with a list of things which one or two of which I had to ask for an explanation, like peng, for example. I had no clue what that was. I then took one or two of the things that I got from Google and presented it to them. And asked them whether they recognized them, and sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. So those are my two sort of prongs of research attack. Nothing academic at all. I didn't look in the corpus, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't, to be honest, because I mean, I'm happy that you did, and thank you for that. That's really quite interesting. But I didn't want to do that because I wanted to keep it fresh. I wanted to be something that's coming from the people, in a sense, right?
I mean, I did because I was really fascinated by the point about it being apparently entirely American. And, looking in one corpus, which has its own limitations, its own parameters in terms of what it seeks to catalogue and not catalogue, is only going to be one particular way of looking at the language. The other thing I tried to do was actually see if I could find an example of a youth speak corpus. And there was one that came up, but frustratingly, it's the Bergen corpus of London teenage language, which is now housed in the University of Bergen. And it was a corpus created from tape recordings and transcriptions of conversations by teens between the ages of 13 and 17. But it seems to date back to 1993.
Oh, yeah. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so very difficult to keep up to date with this stuff, because it's changing all the time. So there's the only kind of the reason to look at a study like that would be to look at rather why those teens are using that language rather than that language itself. So as a sociolinguistic study, that's quite useful. But to find out what people are actually using right now, today, I don't think it's terribly useful.
There's a question that's come into Q&A from Salvatore Novello. Are there already any books or corpora about this youth slang? I think we've kind of identified that we need to do there needs to be a bit of digging to see if there's anything in terms of corpus linguistics. Any books that you're aware of?
No. And we go back to the same reason, really. As soon as you write it, it'll be out of date.
Essentially.
So, I mean, yeah. I mean, the only thing that, if we want to go a little younger into truly young learners, I mentioned one of my greatest irritants is this business of getting young learners to be using language that adults use, like talking about the weather, for example. There is really no reason at all, because at that age, in that age group, the language doesn't really change because it's topic based. You know, my dad's bigger than your dad. I've got a red bus, have you? That's the kind of language that kids of 7 or 8 or 9 are most likely using. But nobody has yet put that into practice and produced young learners course book that actually reflects that language. It's what I call the playground corpus. No one's done it. What a shame. But to do it with teen language is far more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why? I mean, we've said, you know, the nature of teenage discourse is that it's shifting sands. It's changing all the time. And it might be easy to kind of suggest that teen identity, trends come, trends go, and therefore is that an explanation for the ephemeral nature of their language, of their code?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, you said a little while ago that perhaps it wasn't to exclude. That teen language was designed to show membership of a group as opposed to trying to exclude. I think I'd like to very lightly disagree with that, because I do think it's designed to exclude as well. I believe that it's looking back at my own youth, you know, 116 years ago. We most certainly were happy and proud of the fact that we could say things that our parents didn't understand, or indeed our teachers didn't understand. So there's no question in my mind that there were two motives. One was I wanted to show that I was part of that group that you're in. I'm one of you, but it was also to say you are not part of this group.
Interesting. And also, as we've both become older and we've moved.
You haven't become older.
Well, yes, as Gabby kindly suggested the other day, that I'm still in my 30s, which was the nicest thing anyone has said for a very long time. I'm 54.
You're not as old as that, are you?
But it certainly, and I don't know if I'm trying to be too academic about it here, but I think there are two things. Number one, as the video was playing, I was thinking, in response to that question about resources, could I, in about 20 or 30 minutes, as someone who, you know, has been around for 30 something years as a teacher, could I come up with a meaningful list of websites that teachers who are watching today could look at? And I have done, and I'm really uncertain about its validity, because I don't know if it's representative. I don't know if it can be representative, but it's probably the kind of websites that students will find themselves. So question number one, is it useful to share with the people who are with us as participants this afternoon a list of websites which have been unfiltered, they've not been checked, they just look to be perhaps useful?
I think if that's a genuine question, I think you know the answer already, because please make them available, and then teachers can go and have a look and decide if it's any use or not. I mean, we're not the censors of the internet for our fellow teachers. They can decide if stuff is useful or not, right?
Here is the list.
There you go. Well done. Good man.
One thing I have done is included the dates of the websites. So it struck me that something from the British Library would probably have a certain amount of academic rigor behind it.
Yes.
But it's also 11 years old.
Yeah.
The Macmillan Dictionary, again, it's coming from lexicographers, but it's 3 years old. And then, you know, we've got some that don't even have dates.
I mean, I would say to teachers looking at those, that, you know, look at them. I'm going to look at them. They're very, very interesting. But don't assume that any language, any forms or lexical features which appear in there are current. So they're not designed like that. They're for another purpose.
Yeah. It's interesting you use that term lexical feature, because I've been lucky. I've seen this video twice now. And what I picked up on listening to it for the second time today was that, in fact, there are at least 3 ways of thinking about this language lexically. So, for example, I asked a colleague of mine who runs a youth club here in Wales. So I've got no idea at all if this is Welsh informed. And by Wales, I mean geographical area, not the separate language. And a phrase that came up, and this is about the teacher, is she's mad bunder. And I would very much anticipate that unless we've got any youth speak experts in the room, that probably that is double Dutch to everyone. It apparently means she's got a big bottom, as in rear end. What I really liked about it, and again, this is interesting because this was a young person, I think about 13, referring to the youth group leader, but doing so in a very kind of playful, friendly way and non-excluding her. You know, there was a trust there. The young person was able to say, Helef, you've got mad bunder. But that struck me as really interesting because structurally, there's no, it's have mad bunder, not you have a mad bunder. So there's a kind of a structural grammatical set of properties as well. And that really fascinated me.
Yes, very, very interesting. I mean, I think that came up at the beginning of my bit as well, where we were looking at, I was looking at the difference between it's a gas and it's fab or something, you know. So that, yeah. Can I just go sideways for a moment, because a couple of interesting questions have come up on the Q&A. It's Fidan who asks, is slang significant to use in everyday English? And I think that the answer to that, as far as I'm concerned, is that it depends on what your students need. If their final context is an area, a social area in which what we'll describe as slang is used, then the answer is definitely yes. And the answer is definitely no if it's not. So that's the first question. And the second one is kind of interesting from Sanela, I think. Why does youth make words shorter? They just use letters. I think, Ben, you're talking about text speak. Is that what you're talking about, I wonder? Or is it really that they're making words shorter? I think that language itself is generally economical. And so if there's a way, I mean, we have redundancy in language, but redundancy in language is to do with, redundancy in language is used to deal with the context in which a message might need to be repeated or in some way extended in order for it to be understood. So if you think about being in a crowded place, Sometimes you have to say things in two different ways. And if you analyze normal everyday language, we do that all the time. We do it, for example, by marking number. So I've got two cars. So it would be perfectly okay to say I've got two car, right? But we mark it, and therefore the S becomes, in a sense, a redundancy. So does youth speak do the opposite? Does it make it more essential? And the answer to that is that first of all, the answer is I don't know. And secondly, I want to know if it's valid to say that at all. I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure that, apart from text speak, I don't know whether spoken youth slang, if you want, actually does that at all. I don't know.
It
Sorry,
does.
long answer.
It does rather make the point, doesn't it, that for someone with your depth of knowledge in terms of English language, that this is an area where you just don't know. And I have no idea either. And I think that perhaps this is quite a fertile ground for academic research. But of course, by the same token, if you're going to do a PhD in this, taking 3 years or 7 years part-time, by the time you get to writing up, all of your data will be out of date.
Absolutely.
I did have a really interesting conversation with the mother of a friend whose son at the time was about 13. And this was over a Sunday lunch, and we were all language geeks. We'd all taught English, and in many cases, people had further degrees in English. And Alfie, the son, had was just checking in on Mum, nice thing to do, and sent a message, "Are you KK?" And I remember Mum saying, "Why can't he write okay?" And in fact, over a series of months, Alfie got to the point where he would be replying to Mum saying, "Are you KK?" She understood this now meant okay. And Alfie would write back, thumbs up, K. So we've got this kind of abbreviating, this truncating of language that you've indicated. So perhaps all we can say is, yeah, it does seem to be a phenomenon, but we don't really know why. I do think what is interesting in the language that Sanel has used is, do we blame social networks? I think perhaps we might take that word blame and consider reframing it as, does it represent social networks? Because it's quite invidious to, I mean, as an old fogey myself, I might think, oh, social media. But actually, it's just a phenomenon. Linguists don't blame, they observe.
No. In fact, I seem to, digging into the depths of my mind, I seem to remember that David Crystal has looked at text speak and countered the accusation that it's ruining the English language. And his conclusion is that it's doing no such thing, and it's part of what youth does. Indeed, not only youth but older people too use, because you're on your phone with your thumbs. I don't particularly do that with my thumbs, but I do it like that, but it saves time. But that's it. It's not ruining English. The important thing, I think, to perhaps put a cap on this bit of the discussion is simply to say that the appropriateness of language is very, very important. I think if we're teaching teenagers, for example, to show them that we can say a THX for thanks is perfectly good. It's perfectly valid. But also to have them understand that a THX cannot be used if you're writing an essay or some other piece of writing. So that's about context, and it's about appropriateness. And that's really, really important, I think.
What I particularly enjoyed, because I've got a bit of a vested interest in it, that isn't the point, was that you kind of framed this question of why do we want to invest in youth speak in a classroom scenario within the context of the negotiated syllabus, the top down, the bottom up, or something in the middle? So is now a time perhaps to shift our discussion towards the negotiated syllabus? Because I think it's a fascinating area, and it might well be of an interesting insight for our participants today. Is that a direction to go in now? Is that, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in largely because, as I said at the start, Youth Speak was simply a device, really, to open up the topic of negotiated syllabus. Yeah. So yes, please.
So someone comes along and they say to you, Steve, negotiated syllabus, what's that all about then? What would you say to them? What is it?
I'd say go and Google it. No, I would say a negotiated syllabus is one which is which has a slider, and the slider goes from top down, where students get little or no input into what they're going to be dealing with, and it slides all the way down to the extreme bottom, which is where, as for example, in a silent way class, where students pretty much decide everything which they're going to do. Now, I'm not proposing that. What I'm proposing is something which is, which first of all is flexible, but also is not extreme ever. It's something which allows for student input, and but is always guided by the teacher. So I'm not going to, if I'm negotiating a syllabus with students and they say, we want to only concentrate on cricketing terms from the game of cricket, I'm going to say, okay, well, you come to the wrong teacher, because I'm not going to do that. What I'll do is balance out a general syllabus, a general idea of the sort of stuff that I think you might need, and I will insert here and there terms about the game of cricket. And I think my own experience, I've always worked that, almost always worked that way. Occasionally I've been forced to work entirely from a book and I hated it, but I've almost always worked that way. And I've found that motivation has increased. People have an ownership. And sometimes I would start a lesson by saying, Mario, do you remember that day when you said to me you wanted to look at X? And Mario says, yes, I remember. And I say, well, today we're going to do that. And they go, oh yeah. You know, and there's a kind of physical reaction.
I mentioned that I've invested in it, and perhaps just to give a very brief overview of my experience of working with the negotiated syllabus as a kind of a lead into a question about how do people working in classrooms where there's a curriculum in place, and you know, there are things that you have to achieve because that's what the Ministry of Education requires of them. But I work for the context I came across the negotiated syllabus was a private language school, very similar to the one where you worked in Oxford, where we had adult students as well as young learners, so 13 to 80. And in both cases, on the Friday at the end of the week, the students could come and go on a weekly basis. We would say to the class, okay, right, what topics are you interested in next week? And we would get a selection of ideas and the consensus would form. And then it would be, okay, I'm going to give you a list of the things that happen in a classroom: 4 skills, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. Which ones are most important to you next week? It didn't end there. It was your point about the teacher coming in with their expertise. That's what people were paying for. That's great. We'll do this, this, and this. I also have noticed this week that I think you need some help with this area that we can develop. Emergent language, basically. And that created the blueprint for the following week. With exam classes where there was a course book, then obviously you get the question, well, how do you then do it with them? And so it was slightly fudged, because very often they'd be very happy to have that in their morning lessons of general English, and then they'd just follow the course book in the afternoon. That was a very privileged place to be. What advice can we share to people with us this afternoon who perhaps are in much more top-down situations where the curriculum says, week 6, you do this? How can the negotiated syllabus be weaved in for motivation, engagement, and all the positive things?
Yeah, I do. I recognize the challenge in that. I've worked as a teaching assistant in some state schools in Europe, and have, you know, as a young teacher, I had exactly those sorts of challenges. But I think that it can almost be used as a reward. I think not a stated position, but an understood position, that if you do this, if we can do this, then we can do that. So it's a bit of a carrot in a sense. I know that you guys want to talk about. I know that you guys want to talk about. You know, I don't know, music. What, I can't think of anything right now. But you know, I know that you guys want to talk about X. If we can get through page 32, page 36 this week, I promise you that we will then spend 20 minutes looking at X, whatever that is. That's the way that I did it as a young teacher, and that's the way I would still do it now. And I do have the greatest sympathy and empathy for those teachers who are in that situation, because it's absolutely ghastly.
I guess an alternative to that is the Friday, or whatever day of the week it is. This, you know, these 4 days of the week are going to be looking at the course book. Here is a day where you set the agenda yourselves, that kind of weekly treat kind of thing.
Yep.
It would be great to know, wouldn't it, from the people that we have on this afternoon's webinar, are any of you working now with a negotiated syllabus? What are its positives? What are the challenges you face? If you're not working with it, how does it sound? Do you think it's achievable? Whilst we give people time to type some answers into chat or into Q&A, something else I wanted to ask in terms of negotiated syllabus is, you've talked quite a lot about ESP, English for pilots, English for cricket fans, whatever it is. How does the negotiated syllabus fit in? Because I think it very much does, when you're working with a group of people who have come to you with a specific need, be it occupational or presentation skills, or help me to negotiate better. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's responsive, because, you know, I mean, going back in my history, I've had groups of architects, groups of bankers. I had this maxillofacial surgeon guy, and they come to you with those specific needs, and your job then is, in fact, to negotiate with them. You know, if you've got a group of bankers, are these people at the what do you call it, the coal face? Are they the people who meet customers, or are they the people who are sitting in the back office negotiating loans with customers? So those are the things that you need to find out, obviously. And so, in a sense, when you're finding that out, this is needs analysis, isn't it? When you're finding that stuff out, you are, in a sense, beginning the process of negotiating a syllabus. They say, well, I don't have to talk to customers about loans or mortgages. What I have to do is to talk to customers about their current account, or how to open a current account, or how to close a current account, and so on. So all that stuff is, in a sense, I'm not quite sure what the word is, but it's automatic in a way.
So, I mean, as an example, or further example of that, I'm right now this week starting a series of 10 hours of classes with a nurse who has been told by her boss that basically her communication skills aren't very good, and that she needs to sharpen up. Poor lady. So, you know, you're starting thinking, well, the first thing I've got to do is build up this lady's confidence.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I did a needs analysis with her a few months ago. We're now at the point where the lessons are starting. But what I've done is, in those 10 hours, I've mapped 6 hours of what I know that she needs. And I have deliberately not mapped the remaining 4 hours, because I want to see what emerges in those 6 hours. But I also want to be able, when I've got her trust, is to say, right, okay, what do you want? What do you need?
Yeah. And also, I mean, this is a very, very interesting, it's a really meaty context here. And I would like to know if she knows more about what her boss means by updating your communication skills or sharpening your communication skills. Is it, when you speak to her, is it obvious, or does she know more, or could you ask her boss indeed? Because that, sharpen your communication skills can mean a million things, can't it? What does it mean, really?
And that was where I was very lucky, but I appreciate for many people, we don't have that privilege, that I said, look, you might be the people paying for the course, but at the end of the day, who are the people involved in this? It's the nurse herself, it's the bosses, it's the patients. So I said, okay, to make this really work, I need to know, this again perhaps comes into what you were talking about, opening and closing a bank account. It's the authenticity of the context, the authenticity of the task. How do you use language? I've asked the nurse, what do you do? And I actually observed her in a simulation of a patient nurse role play in order to assess the strengths and the weaknesses. So I think trying to wrap things up a little bit. I mean, we've still got 10 minutes to go, which is great. So we've got, on the one hand, youth speak as an example of one of many areas that a client or a group wants to focus on. And we've got an emergent understanding now of how to shape a series of lessons or a whole course based around negotiation. Have you got any further tips that we could share with our colleagues watching us in terms of how to make that really shine, how to make the best of the situation?
No.
Okay.
No. Let me think about that for a moment. I mean, because I believe very strongly in the idea. For me, it's something which is kind of obvious. It seems to me that asking students about their end context, in other words, where are you going to use language? Where are the places that you're going to use language?
Yeah.
It's a fabulous idea on many levels. And first of all, as a psychological device, what it's saying to students is, I'm interested in where you're going with this course of study. And I don't think teachers do that enough. I think teachers very often forget that relationship with students and the importance of implying and having students infer that you're actually interested in where they're going on their journey. Then, having established that, we need to look at the road. We need to look at the roadmap. Okay, so this is where you're going to be using English. Fantastic. How shall we get there? What do you need to get there? How can I help you get there? What can I give you? What can I expose you to? Obviously not using this kind of language. We're talking amongst ourselves here, amongst teachers. So how can I help you to get where you need to go? What do you need from me? What resources can we go to find the stuff that you need? Have I got it already, or do I have to go and study something? Probably I have to go and study something, like my dentist surgeon. I had to go and look at I had to go and watch him cutting bodies up in order to be able to help him. So, yeah, sorry, go.
I think for me, the absolute positive was just how much I learned. Because rather than just following a course book, which, can be a bit dull, suddenly this whole world opened up where it was a multilingual context, students from different countries coming to the UK, maybe 10 different nationalities in the room, and the intercultural opportunities. But the privilege I had of being able to learn from them made every day genuinely delightful, because I
Absolutely.
knew what was going to happen. That was exciting. I think one thing that perhaps people do worry about when they start with the negotiated syllabus is, where am I going to get my materials from?
Yeah.
And
that, I think, is, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's also what Gabby is saying in the chat here, that teachers don't forget, but they don't have the confidence, and they fear the unpredictability, and that's all about it's all about having the confidence to approach something with your students. I think that teachers often see themselves as, without wishing to, I think they often see themselves as being remote, in the sense that they're alone, you know, that they're doing a job on their own. And in a way, that's true. I've always said, you know, we're great to have a teachers union, worldwide teachers union, but very difficult because we're all isolated. When you take that idea and then you say, well, actually, I'm not isolated at all because I've got my students with me. I'm working with these people. I'm not. Yes, with itness, being with your students rather than lecturing. Exactly that. So I think that when you start to think about it, it's, or teachers say to me, you know, I don't like to be observed. And I say, well, you're observed in every single lesson that you do. And I go, oh, yeah, okay. So when you start to think of yourself as part of a team, rather than being it there at the front of the room with all that responsibility. Of course, you do have responsibility. You have responsibility to guide and to show and to blah, blah, blah. But see yourself as working within a team, all of you. Even with young learners, I suggest that they will rise to that challenge. And that is also very, very much connected with the whole idea of negotiating a syllabus, because negotiated syllabus means that you have the confidence that you can work with your students, for your students, but they can also work with you.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That once you've had, and it's probably just a 5-minute light bulb moment of, books are still useful. They can guide and help particularly less experienced teachers in terms of presenting a particular grammar point that's been identified by the students or by you as being useful. But so it's not about giving up on, you know, all of the materials we have access to.
No.
Actually not needing, and this is the liberation that I found, it's not needing to be in control and not needing to be that person that you feel that perhaps as a teacher you need to be on a pedestal. You actually are saying, yeah, it's the old Jane Arnold metaphor of handing over. You're in the driving seat, group of students. I'm just here to kind of nudge us when appropriate. And
I think that's right. I think it's also important that students have the confidence to know that if there's a problem, you will resolve it. So I don't necessarily like the idea of handing over. I want to work with let's work together.
Okay, yeah.
And just to, if I can just connect this with another of my kind of favorite ideas, really, and that's about silence in the classroom, where teachers feel they have to fill silences and thus don't give students time to think. I think this is also really important. And there's also a psychological aspect to that as well, because when you allow silences to happen and don't force people to fill them and don't fill them yourself, what you're doing is creating space. And students, it can take a little bit of time, because they may not be used to that. But students will begin to realize that what you're doing is actually for their benefit. You're thinking about them. And this is, you know, all that kind of, if you want, that background woke psychology stuff. It's all really, really important in my view, because it sets the tone of the classroom. And you may never talk about it. You may never see it in reality. You may never see what what all that stuff does, but you'll see the result of all that stuff. Does that make sense?
I'm lucky because I've been able to work in that context, and it is something that I carry on. My context now is teaching online, and pretty much I can do what I want. No, let me rephrase that. I know that I can allow my students to advise me on what I do and how I do it, and just bring in a bit of my own experience to kind of shape it a bit. But it's really nice to be in a context where I have that luxury. But what I really value, Steve, is, you know, the suggestions you were making, that for teachers who don't have that luxury of basically being able to be the teacher they want to be because that's the right teacher for that learner at that time. But sometimes you just have to follow a way. But thank you so much for sharing with us this afternoon, not only the framework of negotiated syllabus, but also those suggestions about, you know, the carrot, or doing it one day and not for the other 4, as a treat, or perhaps better, not as a treat, as a validation of their role as part of that teacher-student interconnection.